The first drug for dangerously high potassium doesn't lower the potassium at all. It's calcium, and that's not a mistake. It makes complete sense once you know what potassium is doing inside a heart cell. It sets the cell's resting voltage. That one idea runs the whole topic. So let's start there, one cell at rest. Picture that cell at rest. It isn't doing nothing, it's holding a charge. The inside sits negative compared to the outside, steady waiting. That steady negative charge is the resting voltage, and it's the starting line every heartbeat starts from. And what holds that line in place, more than anything else, is potassium. So when potassium builds up in the blood, outside the cell, it doesn't just look bad on a lab. It physically drags that starting line upward. And when you move the starting line, you change every beat that starts from it. That's the whole topic. Everything else, the ECG, the danger, the treatment, is just what happens when that line moves. Let's go inside one heart cell and build this slowly, because everything later depends on it. A cell is just a tiny bag of fluid, sitting in more fluid. The wall of the bag is the membrane. And floating in that fluid is potassium. Where the potassium sits is what this whole thing is about. Here's the first key fact. There's a lot of potassium inside the cell and very little outside. If you measured it, you'd get about 140 inside and only about 4 outside. That 4 is the normal level in the blood, the number you actually see on a lab. Don't get stuck on the units. Just hold the picture, packed inside, nearly empty outside. Now, potassium carries a positive charge. And being so crowded inside, it wants to spread out, so it slips out through tiny openings in the membrane called channels, from the packed inside toward the empty outside. Watch what that does. Every positive potassium that leaves takes a little positive charge with it. So the inside of the cell is left a little more negative than the outside. But it doesn't just keep leaking until it's empty. Here's why. Potassium is positive, and the inside is getting more and more negative, and opposites attract. So the more negative it gets in there, the harder that negative inside pulls the positive potassium back. Potassium is being pushed out by the crowding and pulled back by the charge. It settles right where those two even out, at about negative 90 millivolts. That difference in charge is called the voltage. And that number, negative 90, is the line. When you see the line on screen, that's all it is, how negative the inside of the cell is right now. At rest, it sits at negative 90, steady. And that's the starting point for every heartbeat, the thing the rest of this video is going to move. Okay, now the thing that actually goes wrong. Remember the picture, packed inside, nearly empty outside. That gap is what held our line down at a nice, deep negative 90. So what happens when potassium builds up outside the cell, which is exactly what's going on when someone's potassium is high. Now the outside isn't so empty anymore. The gap between inside and outside shrinks. And here's the key. A smaller gap means less potassium leaks out. Less positive charge leaves. So the inside doesn't get as negative, and our line drifts up. From negative 90, up toward negative 70. And yes, 70 is a smaller number than 90. But negative 70 is closer to 0, which means less negative. On our scale, the line is climbing. That doesn't sound like much. But watch what it does to the heartbeat. First, how a beat even happens. A heart cell fires when its voltage climbs to a certain trigger point, called the threshold. And what actually fires it is a set of tiny sodium gates. Hit the threshold and they snap open, sodium floods in, and that rush is the cell firing, a signal that jumps to the next cell and the next, sweeping across the whole heart. That sweep is what drives the heartbeat. Now here's the catch. Those gates have a rule. After they fire, they have to reset, swing back to a closed and ready position before they can open again. And they only reset when the cell drops back down near negative 90. But our line is stuck up at negative 70, so the gates never fully reset. They stay stuck and unavailable. And that's the trap. The line is sitting closer to the trigger, so you'd think firing would get easier, and for a second it does. But most of the gates can't open. So fewer gates fire, the signal comes out weak and slow, and it barely passes from one cell to the next. So here's the part that surprises people. The danger of high potassium isn't a racing heart. It's a failing one. The signal gets weaker and slower until it can't move through the heart at all. So far we've been deep inside one cell. Now let's pull back to what you'll actually see on the monitor, the ECG. Here's all an ECG is. Every one of those firing signals from millions of heart cells added up and drawn as a line. When the heart fires normally, that line makes a few bumps in order. A small bump as the top chambers, the atria, fire, a tall spike as the big bottom chambers, the ventricles, fire, and then a rounded bump as the ventricles reset for the next beat. And those bumps have names you'll be tested on. The small bump is the P wave, the big spike is the QRS, the reset bump is the T wave, P, QRS-T. Now let's raise the potassium and watch that pattern change, the classic progression, as it climbs. The first thing to move is the reset bump, the T wave. Remember, potassium drives the reset. So with extra potassium around, the ventricles reset faster and more sharply, and that rounded bump turns tall, narrow, and pointed. That's a peaked T wave, the earliest warning on the monitor. Push the potassium higher, and the trouble we built in the last section starts to show. The signal is getting weak and slow. It slows on the way from the top chambers to the bottom. That gap, the PR interval, stretches out. And the top chamber's own signal gets weaker, so their little bump, the P wave, flattens and can disappear completely. Then the big spike, the QRS, the ventricles firing, starts to widen. Remember that slow, struggling signal crawling cell to cell? When it crawls through the bottom of the heart, the spike smears out, wider and wider. Keep going, and that widened spike blurs right into the reset bump, until the whole tracing rolls up and down like one smooth wave, a sine wave. That pattern means the heart is right at the edge of stopping. After it comes a chaotic, useless quiver, ventricular fibrillation, or a flat line, asystole. Either way, the heart can't pump. So the ECG isn't a new set of facts to memorize. It's the same story we built inside the cell, now showing up on the monitor, peaked T, then the PR stretches and the P flattens, then the spike widens, then the sine wave, then a rest. Okay. Now the part that keeps your patient alive, and the part the exam zeroes in on. There are 3 jobs and they go in this order: stabilize, shift, remove. Job 1, stabilize the heart. And this is the single most tested idea in the whole topic, so let's be very clear. When potassium is high enough to threaten the heart, when you're seeing ECG changes like those peaked Ts, the first drug you give is calcium. And calcium does not lower the potassium. So why give it first? Go back to our picture. The resting line has drifted up to -70, sitting dangerously close to the trigger, the threshold, and the heart signal is failing. Calcium doesn't push that line back down, it doesn't touch the potassium. Instead, it moves the trigger point itself up and out of the way, it raises the threshold. And that restores the gap. Suddenly, there's a safe distance again between the resting line and the trigger, so the heart can conduct more safely while you work on the potassium. Calcium buys you that safety in minutes, but the potassium is still high, still sitting outside those cells. Job 2, shift the potassium out of the blood and into the cells, to get it away from the heart for now. Insulin does this. It drives potassium into cells, and you give sugar, glucose, alongside it so the insulin doesn't drop the blood sugar too low. Nebulized albuterol, the same drug used for asthma, shifts it too, usually as an add-on. But notice, shifting isn't fixing. The potassium isn't gone. It's hiding inside the cells, and it'll leak right back out when those drugs wear off, unless you actually get rid of it. Job 3, remove the potassium from the body. That's the only step that lowers the total. A potassium binder, a medicine that stays in the gut and traps potassium so it leaves in the stool, does it slowly over hours. A water pill, a loop diuretic, flushes it out in the urine if the patient is still making urine. Or dialysis, which filters it straight out of the blood, the definitive fix, especially in kidney failure, the most common reason potassium climbs this high in the first place. So, stabilize, shift, remove. Calcium protects the heart. Insulin and albuterol shift potassium out of the blood, temporarily. And only that last step, binders, diuretics, dialysis, actually takes potassium out of the body. Let's put this to work, because the exam tests it in a few predictable ways, and you already know all of them. You'll get a patient with a dangerously high potassium and ECG changes, and the question asks what you do first. The tempting answer is insulin, because insulin lowers the blood potassium. But you know better now. First, you stabilize the heart. Calcium comes first. You lower the level second. They'll test that calcium point directly, too. Does calcium lower the potassium? No. It protects the heart, it doesn't change the number. And you know exactly why. And they'll show you an ECG strip, a high potassium with tall, pointed T waves. That's the earliest classic sign, and it means act now, not recheck in an hour. You don't memorize that, you can see it. The line has already started to move. None of these are tricks. They're just the mechanism you already understand, asked as a question. Here's the real test. Can you rebuild the chain? Potassium sets the line. Raise it, the line drifts up, the gates stop resetting, the signal fails, and you see it on the ECG. Peaked T, then the PR stretches and the P flattens, then a widening QRS, then a sine wave. Then calcium reopens the gap to protect the heart, shifting buys time, and removal actually clears the potassium out. If you can walk that start to finish, you own this. And if any link felt shaky, that's your gap. Go back to that section and run it again until it clicks. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.